Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, if it is indeed morning. It's very hard to tell what day it is anymore. Today's story, The Chariot of the Sun. The main character in it, there seems to be some debate as to how to pronounce his name, but I'm going to go with Phaethon. If you know it pronounced differently, do let me know, but every time I've tried to check into it, there's 3 or 4 different versions. But I think Phaethon is, well, it's what I'm going to go with anyway. We have today's story, The Chariot of the Sun. The Queen looked down at her son's troubled face and sighed. She knew all too well what he was about to ask her. I've been thinking, Phaethon said. You and I are so alike. You're obviously my mother, but I'm not in the least like the king, who is my real father. His mother could hide the truth from him no longer. You're right, she said, stroking her son's coppery hair. You aren't the king's son by birth, although he loves you dearly. Now you're ready to know the truth. I'll tell you. Your real father is Helios, the sun god. Phaethon glanced at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, casting a fiery orange glow into the sky. Really? He whispered. Really, the Queen replied. She gestured to his golden-haired sisters playing on the lawn. He is your sister's father too. Phaethon turned to her with determination in his eyes. I need to meet my real father, he said. Will you tell me how to find him? His mother explained how to reach the sun god's palace and saddled him a trusty horse to ride on. Come back safely, she called as he set off into the evening, and his sisters all stood in a row and waved goodbye. Phaethon headed east. He rode all night until at last, just before morning, he reached the rosy gates of dawn. His father's golden palace rose up majestically behind them. It gleamed so brightly he had to shade his eyes. Leaving his horse at the gates, Phaethon went inside. He climbed the glittering steps of the palace with his heart in his mouth and knocked at the vast gold door. When a servant opened it, he said as boldly as he was able, Please tell Helios that his son has come to see him. The servant nodded and disappeared for a few moments. Then he returned and showed Phaethon through a grand hall studded with pearls and precious jewels into another room where a man was sitting on a golden throne. The man was handsome and noble-looking with bright golden hair and a golden beard. He smiled warmly at the nervous boy and said, Phaethon, my son, welcome. You know my name, Phaethon said in surprise. I know everything about you, Helios replied. I've watched you every day since you were born. Phaethon frowned. Then why have I never met you? He asked. Come and sit down, Helios said, and I'll explain. My job as the sun god is to drive a chariot carrying the sun across the sky. Early every morning I have to harness up my 4 horses and set off. I carry the sun up and up to the highest point and then down the other side of the sky to the west. After sunset I sail back home on the river of oceans to surround the earth. Then at dawn I have to start all over again. I came to see you, then the sun wouldn't appear in the sky. The whole world would be dark and cold. I see, said Phaethon, but his eyes were full of disappointment. Helios felt a pang of guilt. Let me make it up to you somehow, he said impulsively. Name any one thing that would make you feel better, and it's yours. He smiled as the boy's eyes lit up. Then Phaethon said, I'd like to take your place for a day. I want to drive your chariot across the sky. Helios's smile faded. The horses are fiery-natured and very difficult to control, he said. Suppose I take you in the chariot with me for the day instead. Phaethon shook his head. I want to do it by myself, he said. Helios looked at his son in silence for a moment. He didn't have the heart to turn him down. Very well, he said at last. Oh, sorry, very well, he said at last. But you must listen very carefully to my instructions. Have you ever driven a chariot before? Hundreds of times, Phaethon lied. Good, well, that's a start, said his father. He led him outside where a team of stable hands were harnessing 4 lively horses to a golden chariot. Phaethon could barely look at the chariot, for in the back of it sat an enormous, blindingly bright sun. They walked to the front, and Phaethon beamed at his father, dazzled by the glory of his task. Don't steer the chariot too high, you'll scorch the heavens, Helios instructed him. And don't go too low, or you'll burn the earth to a crisp. Phaethon, are you listening to me? Yes, said Phaethon impatiently. The horses were harnessed, but they reared and snorted wildly. Their manes flickered like flames, and fire burned in their eyes. These horses need a firm hand at all times, Helios said. If you let them have their heads even for a moment, all will be lost. The boy climbed into the chariot and took hold of the reins. You must be careful, Phaethon, Helios told him anxiously. Phaethon nodded, barely listening in his excitement. The rosy gates of dawn swung open, and the horses leapt into action. He let out a yell of exhilaration as the chariot lurched into the open sky. Driving his father's chariot was better than any dream. As he soared, the sky turned from black to warm blue, and the land below was flooded with the sun's golden light. Higher and higher the chariot climbed, and Phaethon felt the power of the horses through the reins as though their strength was his own. Faster, faster, he urged them and they climbed so high that he could almost touch the stars. He flung his head back, thrilled, and gazed at the twinkling constellations, the great lumbering bear and the bull with its mighty horns. Phaethon was so busy gazing at the stars he didn't notice the horses were climbing far too high. Behind him the sun was blazing a white hot trail across the sky. Only when the stars were so close that the bull threatened to gore him with his twinkling horns did Phaethon look down and gasp. The earth was suddenly frighteningly far away. Terrified, the boy grappled with the reins, but the strength of the horses was too much for him. They lurched from side to side, and then they plunged down, heading straight for the earth. It was all Phaethon could do to hold on. Down below, people all over the world were watching the sky in horror as a strange and worrying sight of the sun veering from its usual path. The chariot sped down and down towards the ground. The horses were completely out of control. Phaethon tugged desperately on the reins, but he may as well have been an ant for all the effect he had. Just as he thought the chariot was about to crash into the ground, the horses changed direction of their own accord and galloped away wildly, hurtling perilously low over the land. Now it's so close to the earth, the sun's sheer heat set fields of crops and trees ablaze and scorched vast areas of land into deserts. Rivers began to boil, streams evaporated in puffs of steam, and seas shrank from the shores in the heat. None of this had escaped the notice of the gods. That very moment, Helios was in Olympus, above the clouds, having been summoned there by Zeus. "What is that boy doing in your chariot?" he demanded, glaring sternly at the lesser god. "He's my son," Helios began weakly. "Oh, never mind the explanation," Zeus interrupted. "The important thing is, how are we going to stop the damage he's doing?" Helios stared in misery down at the chariot, which was lurching over the mountains, melting deep icy glaciers and causing floods in the valleys beneath them. "It will stop at the end of the day," he said haltingly. "It's barely midday now," Zeus snapped. "He could have destroyed the entire planet by this evening. I'm sorry, Helios, but there's nothing else to do." He pulled out a thunderbolt, took aim, and threw it at the chariot. Poor Phaethon never knew what hit him. The thunderbolt blasted him from the chariot of the sun. His lifeless body plunged through the sky like a falling star, eventually landing in a wide, winding river. Without the panic-stricken boy tugging on the reins, the horses gradually calmed down. They galloped on in a fairly straight course across the rest of the sky. However, with nobody to control them, they crossed the sky much more quickly than usual, resulting in an unusually short day. Helios waited in the west for the empty chariot, tears spilling from his eyes. His horses thundered in, their mouths foaming and their eyes still wide and wild. Through his tears, Helios murmured soothingly until they came to a shuddering halt in front of him and lowered their tired heads to nuzzle his outstretched fingers. Phaethon's poor mother and sisters hurried to the river where he had fallen. Phaethon's mother had realised what must be happening as soon as the sun had started hurtling off course. She had seen the thunderbolt and watched with a sinking heart as a tiny black speck fell from the sky. When they reached the river, however, Phaethon's body was long gone. They sank to their knees and wept. His sisters couldn't bring themselves to leave the banks of the river. In fact, they stayed there so long, they gradually turned into poplar trees, which continued to weep, and their tears fell as golden amber. Phaethon's mother returned home alone that night to find Helios waiting on the steps of her palace. She looked at him with empty eyes. "I can't do anything to bring him back," the sun god said sadly. "I can't tell you how sorry I am, but I wanted you to know that our son will be remembered. Zeus has placed him among the stars." He pointed to the night sky, where a new twinkling constellation of stars had appeared. Ever since then, Phaethon could be seen at night, high in the sky where he had felt so elated. The constellation came to be known as Auriga, which means the charioteer. So there you go. Another one of these kind of explanation stories. Before people, had science. They used stories to explain the seasons, like in the earlier story, and how the sun worked and all that kind of stuff. But also, interesting, something that does come up in quite a lot of the Greek myths, a warning, a way of, adults telling children sort of moral lessons about how to behave, about being cautious, about not getting ahead of yourself, about what's the word? I don't know. If I think of it, I'll let you know. But yes, it's a cautionary tale, I think, in a real sense. Not that you're going to get into the chariot of the sun, but yeah, be careful what you wish for. So yeah, so some ideas for things you could do off the back of that. Obviously, you could just do a straight retell. You could write your own version of the story. Or you could draw a picture to accompany any part of it. You could do it from the perspective. You could write a story from the perspective of one of the other people in it. You could write a story from the perspective of Helios as he sees the chariot go off, or Zeus or his mother. Or you could think about, if you could, in a sort of Greek style, if you could take control of an aspect of nature for a day, what would it be? Phaethon took control of the sun for a day. Would you like to take control of the moon for a day, of storm clouds, of rainbows, something to do with the sea? What would you, of a volcano, what would you like to take control of for a day, and what would you do with it? So there you go. Those are a few ideas. You want to do a bit more writing or drawing. There you go. There will be more myths following. Website, when all the stuff with the website's back to normal, we'll get them all up there. So thanks for listening.